This article is brought to you by Wad Talk Magazine. Receive 50% off Wad Talk Magazine by using the code CYBER50 at checkout. 120 Miles in 6 Days by Gary Worrall. About a year ago, my neighbor, the editor of Wad Talk Magazine, Chris Elmore, called out to me over the fence between our yards. "I thought of something epic we could do," he said. Chris told me about the Trans-Rockies Run, a 120-mile, 6-day stage race across the Colorado Rockies. Chris and I have been neighbors for about 9 years, so I knew he was a 4-time Ironman competitor. I hear the weights slamming around his garage every day, and on my way to work, I see him running repeats up and down the street. There is a reason he is the editor of a fitness magazine. I'm an adequate marathon runner. I love trail running and obstacle racing. I lift weights on my lunch break. I tend to enter races to force myself to train, primarily for the health and wellness benefits, but also because I love to compete. However, I was a little intimidated about the prospect of running 120 miles with Chris. I responded to him with trepidation and half-hearted commitment. A couple weeks later, we registered for the 2014 Trans-Rockies Run in the 80-plus team event, and I accounted for the majority of the 80 years. Chris and I squeezed training into our busy lives. We spent innumerable hours away from our families to run the trails of Chino Hills State Park in Southern California. For some altitude training, we ran to the top of Mount Baldy and Mount San Jacinto. Chris even solicited the assistance of a coach, Mark Matiziak. He drew up training plans, ran with us, and gave us valuable racing advice. He's the real deal. To acclimate, Chris and I flew to Colorado a few days before the race in late August. We did a training run and discovered that the altitude affected us. We needed lots of water to counteract the insistent headaches. Chris found us a rental house in Buena Vista that was perfectly located next to the start of the race. One of the best parts of the event was watching the runners gather in the cold at the start line while we waited until the last minute in our warm condo. The race started with AC/DC's Highway to Hell blaring and an energy level normally reserved for grander events. For the first stage of the race, we ran 21 miles and climbed about 2,500 feet from Buena Vista to the Railroad Bridge campground. The last 4 miles were hot and monotonous. The stage finished near the Arkansas River, so we were able to cool our legs. Chris and I worked out the sleeping logistics after a quick shuttle ride to the campsite. The two of us and all of our gear would be sharing a 7x7 tent for the remainder of the week. The Trans-Rockies Run is very well supported. Chris and I were treated to all the food we could eat for dinner and breakfast every day. A relaxation station in the campsite was stocked with food and drinks to help stave off the inevitable calorie deprivation. Round-the-clock medical attention and massage and foam rolling were provided. The volunteers were helpful and friendly, and the staff provided informative briefings for the upcoming stage every day. Despite all the support, Chris and I still worried about the days to come. How we finished the first day is beyond me. How we were going to do this 5 more times was incomprehensible. For motivation, I continuously thought of my niece Annika, who was diagnosed with cancer last year and endured 6 months of chemotherapy. I told myself, if Annie can endure those months of poison, I could endure 6 days of torture. Chris was generous to share my tenacity. Stage 2 would prove to be the most arduous climb. Even though it only covered 14 miles, we climbed 3,200 feet from Vicksburg to Twin Lakes Dam. We crested Hope Pass at 12,500 feet above sea level. This was our highest point of elevation during the race. The downhill run was very technical and steep, and by the end of the descent, our quads were screaming. We camped in Leadville, home of the famed Ultra Marathon. Chris and I found a restaurant in town to guiltlessly stray from our diets and gorge ourselves on hamburgers, chicken strips, and fries. The next morning, we began Stage 3 in Leadville. This was purported to be our longest run, measuring 25 miles and climbing 2,700 feet. As we neared the finish line in Nova Guides at Camp Hale, we encountered rain. The last few miles were wet, but at least they were flat. This was the halfway point of our race. The 3-day runners were done, and the field went from 400 to 300 competitors. Both of us began to believe that completing this race might actually be possible. Stage 4 started from Nova Guides at Camp Hale and climbed 2,800 feet for more than 14 miles into Red Cliff. After a steep climb above the tree line, we recklessly ran down the mountain where the trail turned into a creek. It was unavoidable. We ran in ankle-deep water for nearly a mile. The cold water was a relief for our tired feet. When we arrived in Red Cliff, we were treated to chips and margaritas at the famous Mango's restaurant. Stage 5 turned out to be our hardest run. The route from Redcliffe to Vale boasted a single long climb of 4,100 feet and stretched more than 24 miles. For the third time, we would climb above the tree line to more than 11,000 feet. Finishing was a test of will for both of us, but finishing also meant only one more day of torture. Stage 6 meant the journey was almost over. Chris and I left Vale and ran towards Beaver Creek. Even though the 20 miles wasn't our longest run, we faced nearly 5,000 feet of climbing. If it wasn't for Chris, I wouldn't have made it. The hills kept coming. Chris and I pushed each other throughout the stage. With just more than a mile to go, we crested our last hill. We could hear the roar of the crowds at the bottom, and even though our legs were exhausted, we ran like kids down the hill to the final finish chute. Crossing the finish line was sweet. We felt fulfilled and celebrated the accomplishment. We were energized and alive despite our fatigued and weakened bodies. We talked about the race for days afterwards with our families and friends. We showed pictures and videos to anyone patient enough to look at them. I used the same word repeatedly to describe the journey, which was the word Chris used to lure me into this race. Epic. The race was indeed epic. Finishing this race meant more than just another bib adorning our garage walls. It was the culmination of months of training and sacrifice. This race showed us that there's always another level of fitness to be attained. It forced us to shift our fitness paradigm and prove that limits are meant to be exceeded. And despite what we believe, we are always capable of more. A few days ago, Chris said to me across our front yards, "I know what we should do next." Stay tuned.